Welcome back to Koine Corner. Today we're looking at the ultimate beatitude from the Sermon on the Mount. But before we look at the ultimate, let's look at the penultimate. So we're in Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, and the first half of the verse in Koine says, Makarioi hoi erenopoioi. So Makarioi, we've seen last week in the beginning of the Beatitudes, happy or blessed. And then hoi erenopoioi is a compound verb that's been turned into a participle. Erene, peace, and poieo, I do or I make. So blessed, we supply the verb to be in the predicate nominative here. Blessed are the ones who make peace, the ones who do peace. So if you think back to a recent Wednesday word of the week, we looked at erene, peace, and we said it had a natural antonym, and that natural antonym was polemos. And polemos is armed conflict or war. So here in the penultimate beatitude, the second to the last, Jesus says, blessed are the ones who make peace, the peacemakers. Blessed are the ones who bring an end to polemos, who stand against conflict. Pretty awesome stuff. Now we look at the dependent clause and see what the response, what the reaction to that blessedness is. One might say the fulfillment of that blessing. Hoti, autoi, huioi, theou, klephesontai. So klephesontai is the last word of the verse, but we should unpack it first because it's going to help us with the rest. So klephesontai is a future passive indicative third person plural verb. Future passive. In the future, something will be done to them. What shall be done to them? Klephesontai, they shall be called. All right, well, let's go back and see what they shall be called. Hoti, because or for, autu, huiu, theou. They, autu, autoi, they, these ones will be called what? Sons of God. Notice it's huioi and not hoi huioi. Not the sons of God, but sons of God. Why does that matter? If the article was present, one could argue that the sons of God is a specific and isolated group, whereas without the article, we're talking about the quality of being sons of God, children of God. This is generic. It includes females as well. So there's no reason. There's nothing in the verse that would make anyone believe that this is a sex-specific designation. It's a masculine noun, but when applied to a group of people, it means both men and women. Keep in mind, he ecclesia, the church, is a feminine noun, but that doesn't mean that there are no men allowed in the church, right? So we talked last time that about how Matthew is the most Hebrew of the Gospels in style and structure and content. And if you think back to something in the Old Testament, names are always important, virtually always important. People's names, places' names, the names of festivals and events and items. Names represent character, nature, purpose, right? And so we think about Adam. His Hebrew name, Adam, is taken from the word for the soil, Adamah, because Adam was made of the stuff of the soil and God breathed life into him and he became a living being, right? And we think about Abram having a name changed to Abraham to represent how fruitful he was going to be as a father. Jacob, whose original name means literally heel sneak, one who supplants the position of his older brother, the second twin taking the priority. His name gets changed to Israel, right? So one who strives with God after wrestling on the shore of the river in the dream. Moses means being taken out of the water, drawn from the basket and the bulrushes in the Nile to be saved from the persecution of the innocent babies. So names are always significant in a Hebrew thinking. And so Matthew, the most Hebrew of Gospels, Jesus tells us, blessed are The peacemakers, for they shall be called, they'll get a new name, they'll be called children of God, sons of God. Think about this. Jesus, sitting on the Mount of Olives, the Son of God, talking to his gathered disciples, giving them insight. This is early in his earthly ministry, giving them insight into things that would come. He talks to them about being poor in spirit, about mourning, about meekness, about being persecuted, about hungering and thirsting after righteousness. All these sort of strivings, and then there are blessings associated with them. But the one that says, you too will be sons of God, is being peacemakers. Jesus, the Son of God, talks about becoming sons of God by being peacemakers. Who's the ultimate peacemaker? The God who sends his only Son to redeem a humanity that has been separated from God by sin. Pretty powerful, pretty awesome stuff. Let's go on to the ultimate beatitude in verse 10. And there's a couple hairy words in here, so I hope you'll pardon me in advance if my pronunciation gets a little wonky. Makarioi hoi dediogmenoi henikin dikaiosounes. So makarioi, again, blessed or happy. We've seen that through the Beatitudes. Hoi dediogmenoi, that's another participle, right? In this case, it's those who have been persecuted. And this is important. Those who have been persecuted. It's a perfect tense. It's a perfect passive participle, nominative plural, and so it's about persecution that happened in the past, but the effects of the persecution remain. They continue. So blessed or happy are those of you who have been persecuted, and then he tells us, henikin dikaiosounes, for the sake of righteousness. Why were you persecuted? Not because of your haircut, not because of the car you drive, but because of your affiliation, your allegiance to righteousness. So the critical thing here is that we're talking about people who've experienced persecution for righteousness's sake. But that persecution continues to affect them today. They carry the scars, they carry the burdens, whether physical or emotional, of the persecution that they've experienced. And then we are told what their consequence is, the dependent clause in the second half of verse 10. Hoti auton estin, he basileia ton uranon. So you may recognize these words if you watched last week, because this dependent clause is exactly the same as the one from the first beatitude. Remember the first beatitude? Blessed are those who are poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And here, blessed are those who are persecuted and continue to experience the consequences of that persecution for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So the exact same reward for those who are poor in spirit and those who've been persecuted for righteousness' sake. So there's at least some similarity in the two, wouldn't you say? Like if you can say that you're poor in spirit and you're carrying the burdens, the ongoing effects of having been persecuted, you could argue that there's some similarity. There's almost a bookending in the Beatitudes with that. So, and then the next signal is obviously the dependent clause is exactly the same. It's identical, verbatim, in verse 3b and in verse 10b. So we can be sure that the unit of the Beatitudes ends here. How can we be sure? Because they have the same grammatical structure. Each one starts with that predicate nominative, blessed are the fill in the blank. And then there's a dependent clause that starts with hoti, because or for, and tells us what the consequence is. We see that 3b and 10b have the same dependent clause. And then we see something interesting in the beginning of verse 11. Let's take a look at the first two words of verse 11. Makarioi este. So makarioi we recognize, we keep hearing it again and again, blessed or happy, but there's no predicate nominative here. Instead, we get a second person plural of the verb eimi, to be. Blessed are you, plural. Instead of saying blessed are the fill in the blank, he says, blessed are you. Well, who are you? Remember, he went up the mountain, seeing the crowds, his disciples gathered around him, and he started to teach them. The you is the crowd gathered around him, his disciples, to hear his teaching, and by extension, the crowd that was that stayed to hear him speak, and by further extension, those who hear the Sermon on the Mount today. Right? Blessed are you, he says. So we know we've broken from the structural form of the Beatitudes, and even to an extent from the thematic form of the Beatitudes. But listen to what he says. I'm not going to read it in Greek. It's way too long. Listen to what he says after makarioi este in English. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So thematically, there's a similar message. You're going to go through some bad stuff. It's not your fault. It's on righteousness. It's for righteousness, for the sake of righteousness. This isn't new. This is how it's always worked in this world that's at enmity with God. They persecuted the prophets. They're going to persecute you too. But it's okay, because you're going to have a great reward in heaven. Like, you'll be comforted if you mourn. If you are hunger and thirst for righteousness, you'll be filled. If you are meek, you'll inherit the earth. The earth that seems to be rejecting you, that you can't seem to find a place in, is actually going to be yours. And the kingdom of heaven is going to belong to those who are weak in spirit, and who are poor in spirit, and who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness. All the same themes are in there, but the structure changes. So he moves then from the abstract, those who are poor in spirit, those who've been persecuted, those who mourn, to the specific, blessed are you. When you experience all this stuff, he's transitioned them into it becoming personal. So both the structure and the grammatical structure and the themes show us that verse 3 through 10 are a closed unit. The Beatitudes are a closed unit. And the transition into you, at blessed are you, tells us that he's moving on with the theme. He's not abandoning the theme. He's going to flesh it out further in application. So there are all sorts of other things we can see in the Beatitudes. For instance, is there in fact a chiastic structure to the Beatitudes? Chiasm, taken from the Greek letter chi, like an X. If you break apart the structure in each of those verses, do they form an X with a meeting point in the middle? That's a subject for another forum. Scholars have argued for years that the Beatitudes each one serves as an introduction to a further section of the Sermon on the Mount. Awesome stuff to explore, but for a different day. And there's tons of other great things that we could explore in the Beatitudes. But for our purposes, looking at the linguistic significance, we've probably covered all we need to cover for now. But we'll probably, through the years, come back. We'll circle around and come back and look at some other things in the Beatitudes. I hope this was good for you. As always, it was great for me, except for my inability to say the word righteousness. Until we see one another again, charis kai irene humin, grace and peace to you.